Welcome everyone. Appreciate that a number of you are still eating and just continue to do so. I'm also conscious that many of you would like to do other things from about 2 o'clock. So we'll keep this afternoon progressing. Just a little bit of background before I introduce our speaker today. Most of you are aware of our operations at Marcus Oldham, that we're the only independent tertiary agricultural and equine college in Australia, and we've been operating successfully for the last 50 or more years. We offer diplomas and degrees, and we attract students from all around Australia and a number from overseas. The interesting thing is that income is derived from student fees, and much of our capital development and in fact our comprehensive scholarship programs and so forth all come from philanthropic contributions, and that we don't receive any government funding. In addition to our full-time courses, rural communities and certainly the farming communities look to educational institutions such as Marcus Oldham for their information, research, development and analysis. And so this led over the last few years to the development and establishment of the Centre for the Study of Rural Australia. And part of that is community engagement activities. And highlights of our community engagement program this year include a number of industry forums, including a foreign investment in agriculture forum which was held last month at the college, and we had 70 industry people, farmers and others, who joined our 130 students, and they learned more about that current issue. The Global Food Boom is our next forum, and that'll be held at July, so you're more than welcome to join us, our staff and our students. Marcus Oldham continues its entrepreneurial development work in communities in both Shepparton and Bairnsdale districts as part of a 3-year project funded through the very generous support from the William Buckland Foundation. The centre has a number of supporters that we're very appreciative of, certainly the William Buckland Foundation, Harwood Andrews Lawyers, the EC Web Trust, ACE Radio and Fairfax Agricultural Media, and I thank them on behalf of the college for their continued support. Our speaker today is a leading world expert in entrepreneurial development. Professor Tom Lyons from the City University of New York is Professor of Management, and he holds a chair in entrepreneurship. Professor Lyons, who has been working at the college for the last few weeks, joined us recently and has been delivering a series of lectures to our students and staff. He's also developing and leading some study tours and workshops in a range of with start-up businesses in both the Geelong and also the Shepparton and Bairnsdale areas. The Geelong study tour, which I know a few of you went on, attracted 45 participants, all keen to learn more about entrepreneurship and the drivers behind successful business. Dr. Yasmin Chalmers, Director of our centre, who you'll meet a little bit later, has also been working with Tom Lyons on the integration of entrepreneurial content into Marcus Oldham's new Master of Agribusiness program. So I welcome Tom Lyons.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start out first by just thanking Simon and everyone at Marcus Oldham for being such gracious hosts to me while I've been here. I've very much enjoyed my first week and a half here, enjoyed working with the EntreBiz project, and look forward to our work out in Shepparton and Bairnsdale in the coming couple of weeks. I'd also like to thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about a subject that for me has been really a passion for the past 27 years, and that's the subject of entrepreneurship-focused or entrepreneurship-centered community economic development. Now, I'm going to explain to you over the course of my minutes with you this afternoon what I mean by that. But basically, just as kind of a sneak preview of my comments, I'd like to start off by making the case for entrepreneurship in the economic development arena. Why is it important? Then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the shortcomings of our approaches to date. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on those of us in North America, the US and Canada. But certainly, if you hear something that sounds familiar to you here in Australia, you can apply that as well. And then I'm going to go on from there and talk a little bit about a solution that a colleague and I developed, which lies at the base of some of the things that we're doing with the EntreBiz project. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. I want to focus also on performance. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the performance metrics for our pilot projects of this endeavor that we put together. And then I'll conclude with a few examples from the field, and then maybe a few recommendations to those of you here in Australia relative to this subject. So that's where I plan to go. Let me begin with this idea of why entrepreneurship. Why entrepreneurship for economic development? Why is it superior to chasing after multinational corporations or trying to encourage businesses that are already located in our communities to expand and to stay within that jurisdiction? Those two strategies have not been working well for anyone globally these days for many reasons. And I think it's kind of interesting to me. I think we're coming full circle in our history because it was entrepreneurs who really started our economies. Their efforts began our economies. We then became very corporate, and we became very reliant on our corporations for jobs and salary and wealth creation, tax base, all of those things. And we kind of lost some of that entrepreneurial spirit for a while. But because those things are backing down now, because corporations, we can't rely on them as much for employment, et cetera, we're coming back around to entrepreneurship again. And I think that's a good thing because entrepreneurs really are change agents in our economies. They are the people who innovate and pursue opportunities and disrupt economies in lesser or greater ways. And that's what really refreshes those economies. And I think we're all in the need for a good refresher of our economy. Now, that's the macro scale. At the micro scale, I would argue that because entrepreneurship tends to be lower cost than other economic development strategies, and because it's a bottom-up strategy, it has a number of advantages, and I've just listed a few of them here. It's economically sustainable because it's small scale, at least in the beginning, until those businesses grow. It draws on local resources, which is beneficial to the local communities where entrepreneurship begins. It's oriented to a focus on human capital as opposed to physical or financial capital. For a long time, economic development has been resource-based. And I think that that assumes that entrepreneurs know how to use those resources. And it doesn't take into account what the obstacles entrepreneurs face to getting those resources are or to using those resources once they get them. At the end of the day, I think we need to worry about the entrepreneurs and helping them so that when they get the resources, they're ready for them. And I'll explain that a bit more as I go along. Finally, entrepreneurship tends to create businesses that have local roots, and businesses that have local roots are more loyal to their communities, less footloose, and use local inputs, and that makes them a very important asset to the community. Many of them ultimately become the philanthropists to our communities and bring many other benefits with them as well. So that's why entrepreneurship. Now, let's talk a little bit about the idea of fostering entrepreneurship, making that economic development policy. In North America, we've relied on something that I call enterprise development. And that's largely a loose collection of programs and projects that are aimed at helping entrepreneurs to get access to technical and financial assistance. Enterprise development includes things like business incubators, small business development centers, micro-enterprise programs, things that I'm sure you have here as well, probably by slightly different names. What I've seen is that there are a number of important shortcomings to this approach to trying to foster entrepreneurship in our communities. And I want to talk a little bit about those because they kind of create the baseline that caused me to want to think about a different way, a new innovation in the way that we do entrepreneurship-focused economic development. One of the problems is that the activities of these organizations tends to be what I call tool-driven as opposed to needs-focused. That is to say that the incubators and these other organizations tend to make a unilateral decision about what entrepreneurs need, and then they hang out their shingle and they say, entrepreneurs, come on and get it. That may not be the right help at the right time in the development of that entrepreneur, and very often it is not. So they're often shooting over the heads of the entrepreneurs, or they're insulting their intelligence by being on a lower level than what they need. It's a one-size-fits-all approach that could be avoided if you were focusing on the needs first and then tailoring the programs to make them work. Secondly, the activities of enterprise development tend to be fragmented and categorical. As typically happens when you create programs or projects, they take on lives of their own. And so they have their own jargon, they have their own protocols, etc., and that causes them to drift from one another, and they begin not working together. They begin to view themselves as being in competition with one another. When that happens, that makes it very hard on entrepreneurs to know where to go to get the right help at the right time. There's too little focus on execution, and by that I mean there's too little focus on performance, too little focus on measuring performance and keeping up with the performance. How are we doing in terms of helping entrepreneurs? We often can't answer that question. Another problem is that the learning cycle's broken, and that's a matter of reflection. We learn by reflecting on what we do and then making adjustments based on what we learn from that reflection. That doesn't happen often enough. Too often we're out there fighting fires and not really stepping back and asking ourselves, why are we doing this, and is this working? And if it isn't, what can we do differently? The focus is also placed on the business and not the entrepreneur. This is something I've harped on for years. You know, it's very interesting that much of what we do with entrepreneurship goes by the label of business development. So that puts the business up front. The problem is that businesses don't run themselves. Entrepreneurs run businesses. If we were helping the entrepreneurs to develop their skills so they in turn could move their businesses through the business life cycle more efficiently and effectively, we would be farther ahead. There's a missing function. In most communities in North America anyway, there's either no one responsible for driving that supply of entrepreneurs in the community, or there are a number of people who are not working together. And that creates a problem as well. And that contributes to the final observation I'm making here, and that the impact of all this fragmented, loose effort, is a lack of scalability. We may get enterprise development in dribs and drabs, but we don't get enterprise development at a scale that can truly transform the economy of any given community or any country for that matter. So, my father used to say that if you're going to criticize, you darn well better have a solution in your hip pocket to offer to people. So in that spirit, my colleague, Dr. Greg Lichtenstein, and I developed something that we call the Entrepreneurial Development System, and it's designed to try to address some of the problems that I just talked about. The mission of the EDS, as I'll call it, is very simple. It's really this first sentence that you see here, to identify and develop entrepreneurial talent. Notice we're focusing on the entrepreneurs. It's not identify business ideas that might succeed, it's identify businesses that have the right team. No, it's about the entrepreneur. Find the entrepreneurial talent and develop it. And the whole philosophy behind this is that if we develop the skill set of an entrepreneur, that entrepreneur will in turn be able to develop their business into a business asset, which of course is a form of wealth. So they're creating wealth for themselves, for their families, and when you take all that effort together, for their communities. That becomes real economic development and not just economic growth. Now, how does the EDS work? Well, essentially it has three subsystems. And we believe it's important to have all of these three things in place so that it becomes sustainable. The first is an entrepreneur development subsystem. This is where we actually work with the entrepreneurs and help them develop their skills. We use a coaching model, which I'll describe, and we place the focus on the skill set of the entrepreneur, and I'll explain that further in a moment. The second subsystem we call the service brokering subsystem. That's really about finding out who all those enterprise developers are out there. Who are the incubators? Who are the micro-enterprise programs? Who are the university tech commercialization programs? Who are the venture capitalists and the angel capitalists? Who are all these folks out here who are purporting to work with entrepreneurs, and then bringing them together into a seamless system that's transparent to the entrepreneur, where everybody is playing their role. I said before that lots of times enterprise developers believe they're in competition with one another. If you actually go out and parse what they do, and we've done this a number of times and have several studies of this, you find that they actually play specific niche roles within a larger system, and you can bring them together in that way, and it works quite well. The third and final subsystem of an EDS is what we call an entrepreneurial infrastructure. The entrepreneurial infrastructure is really that larger community entity that supports this business entrepreneurship activity. To build an entrepreneurial infrastructure, you have to build civic entrepreneurship, which is government officials thinking and acting entrepreneurially, and social entrepreneurship, which are individuals who have a passion for a social mission, and they can learn how to use the skills of business entrepreneurship to pursue that mission. And when they do, they're providing a service that's beneficial to the community. Let's just take a quick example. Let's say that we find in a particular community that many people have trouble being entrepreneurs because they don't have good daycare. If someone was to come along and build a daycare center, build a venture out of a daycare center, that would be providing a service that would also be in support of the activities of the business entrepreneur. So it's linking all of the sectors together into a true system. Now, the heart and soul of all of this is entrepreneurial skill. And I've defined skill as we define it in our book, Investing in Entrepreneurs, and you can read that for yourselves. But let me just say that this was considered somewhat revolutionary when we brought this up. The idea that really success in entrepreneurship is about the mastery of a skill set. There are still some people, despite evidence to the contrary, out there who believe that entrepreneurs are born, that they have innate characteristics or traits. Researchers have been unable to find a single innate characteristic or trait that's true across entrepreneurship. And some of the things that we think are traits, innate traits, things like the willingness to take risks, is less about the willingness to take risks than it is about knowing how to manage risk, which is a skill. So I'm arguing to you that if we want to be successful in helping entrepreneurs, we help them to build their skill set. We don't focus on traits. We don't focus on behaviors because they're just reflections of skill. We don't focus on cognition because that isn't something you can act on. You focus on skills because you can act on that. You can help people develop skills through practice. So with that at the basis then, we think about entrepreneurship is actually being a ladder of skill development that the entrepreneur has to climb. So at any point in time, if you measure the entrepreneur's skill, you can place them on a step on this ladder. And we simply call them level 1, level 2, through level 5. The idea, of course, is to work with the entrepreneur to help them no matter where they come to entrepreneurship at that point in time, and some entrepreneurs are more skilled than others coming in at any given stage. You work with them wherever they are and help them to move to that next rung and on up the ladder of skill development so that they achieve skill mastery. Now that begs the question, how do you measure skills? What are the skills of entrepreneurship? We've been thinking about this for about 10 years with the help of a psychologist from the University of Chicago, who also happens to be my brother. And John Lyons is a world-renowned psychological assessment expert. And he actually developed a new way of testing, psychological testing, that moves away from psychometrics, which is about predicting things. We weren't interested in predicting things. We were much more interested in diagnosis And so he developed a model that he calls communometrics. Communometrics uses a clinical process. So the test is a clinical test. That means you know where somebody is now relative to their entrepreneurial skills, and you can provide a treatment. You can prescribe a treatment as a doctor would for that entrepreneur. And so we created a tool for this testing that we call the Readiness Inventory for Successful Entrepreneurship, or the RISE. And that tool measures 30 different skills that we've identified through our work and through the literature that are necessary for successful entrepreneurship. And they fall into 4 major categories. I won't go through all 30 skills. I wouldn't bore you that way. But let me just talk about the major dimensions of skill. Some skills have to do with creativity and innovation, which are very important aspects of entrepreneurship. Another set of skills that's measured in the RISE have to do with one's ability to create relationships, build partnerships, build networks, make connections. Another set of skills has to do with basic business, the kinds of things you learn in business school, accounting, finance, marketing, etc. And then the 4th group of skills has to do with the ability to administer an organization, which is what you have to do when you run a business. So the RISE measures those things, and it places the entrepreneur at a particular rung on that skill ladder that I just showed you. We have had the opportunity, and this has been a wonderful thing, to be able to beta test this tool with Marcus Oldham College through the EntreBiz program. And we're getting ready to roll out the web-based version of this. In fact, John Grace and I are testing it a little bit now to get rid of some final bugs before we take it out into the field. And we're looking forward to this because, one, we believe it'll help our rural enterprise developers in Shepperton and Bairnsdale to work more strategically with their client entrepreneurs. And 2, because it's going to yield a lot of very valuable data for learning going forward relative to what works in entrepreneurship and how one actually goes about developing skills. Now, once you've measured the skills, what happens? Well, essentially you need a way to help develop skills. So if you know someone is a level 1 entrepreneur, you know through the RISE assessment that they have certain weaknesses and they have certain strengths, and you want to try to leverage those strengths, and you want to help them overcome the weaknesses and build that skill set so they can move to the next step or the next rung on the ladder. To do that, we use coaching. We believe coaching is the best way to develop skills because coaches provide continuous feedback. And if you've ever read Malcolm Gladwell and you've heard the idea of 10,000 hours of practice is necessary to master a skill, the coach helps to insist upon the 10,000 hours of practice to give the execution necessary to do that, but they also give feedback on that practice. They also help the entrepreneur to be strategic about that practice, so they're not just practicing anything, they're practicing what they need to be practicing. And so we use coaches, and the coaches coach on a one-on-one basis, but they can also coach in peer groups at the same skill level, and we find that's very effective. It allows for moral support. It allows for forcing reflection. As a matter of fact, some of the entrepreneurs and some of the projects where we've used the EDS tell us that their peer group is very much like their advisory board. Some group they can get together regularly, they're fellow entrepreneurs, they have similar issues, and they're able to work those out together. So the coach creates a development plan for the individual entrepreneur. That's revisited every 6 months, and then the coach works with the entrepreneur individually and also as a peer group. The whole idea, of course, is to transform the skill set so that the entrepreneur can transform their business. We can also think about this with regard to those service providers, those enterprise developers that I was talking about, because we found in our research that they tend to operate, their capacity allows them to operate at a certain skill level best. So you can match the skill level of the entrepreneur to the skill level of the service provider and be very precise about the way that you do this. So the entrepreneur is getting the right help, the right technical or financial assistance at the right time, so the right stage in their own development as they're building their skills, and at the right price, which has to do with their ability to pay. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the projects. These are pilot projects that we've undertaken in various places. Some of them use the EDS in full, others partially. Louisville, Kentucky was the very first use of the EDS model. That was an inner city model where we were working with African American entrepreneurs in low-income neighborhoods, and we were fostering entrepreneurship using the EDS there. In Advantage Valley, which includes 11 counties in the states of Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia, we're working in a large rural region. It's a natural economic region, and we were able to work there in a 6-year pilot before we handed it off to them. Some very interesting results there, and I'll share a little bit of that with you in just a bit. We also did a major pilot in central Louisiana, which I'll talk about in more detail, so I won't embellish here. Partial efforts with the EDS. We worked with the Boston Consulting Group in Johannesburg, South Africa, working with black entrepreneurs in the garment industry and using this idea of the ladder of skill development. And then most recently, I've been working with folks at Kosminski University in Poland, a business and economics school, who have a partnership with the city of Warsaw. And basically what the city wants to do is become an entrepreneurial city. And there are many ways to do that. What they're trying to do is foster entrepreneur networks in the various districts of the city. And so we're working with them to help them make that happen, and we're using EDS principles in doing that. Now, I just wanted to give you a little more insight into one of our pilot projects. This happens to be the one from Central Louisiana. We call it the Entrepreneurial League System of Central Louisiana. It was in, the pilot was run for 4 years before we handed it off to the locals. And basically it's a 9-parish or 9-county region in the heart of that state. And our benefactors there was a community foundation called the Rapides Foundation. A little bit of background on the geography and the demographics of central Louisiana. Probably should have put this in hectares, but you get the idea that the land area is 25% of the entire state, so it's a big area. Underpopulated, only about 350,000 people live there. This may not be underpopulation by Australian standards, but I can assure you that in America this is a very sparsely populated area. 41 people per square mile, and an area that was suffering considerable poverty. Almost 1/4 of the population lived in poverty. So this was a challenge. This was a challenging area to try out the EDS principles and see if they would work. As of the end of the pilot project on June 30th, 2010, we had 70 active entrepreneurs and their businesses participating in our program. We had 6 peer teams that were working together, and the skill level distribution was 34% were at level 1, 50% at level 2, and 16% at level 3. And we were also able to track movement. So we saw a number of businesses that moved from level 1 to level 2 to level 3. We had quite a bit of that activity. One of the things that the Rapides Foundation wanted was to spread out into the rural areas away from the city, the principal city in this area, Alexandria. And Alexandria is about 50,000 people. We still had, at the end of the project, about 46% of our entrepreneurs from Alexandria, but 22% were from elsewhere in that same parish, and 32% were from outside of the parish, and those numbers were continuing to grow, so we were proud of that as well. Just a few metrics here. Overall, during the 4-year period, we developed 110 entrepreneurs in their businesses and moved them up the ladder. We saw growth in sales revenue of over $60 million US, and the percentage increase in sales revenue from the time we started to the time we ended was 30%. Increased sales revenue per employee, about $190,000. Growth in employees, 37% among those that we were working with. The cost of creating a new job, something economic developers love to look at, about $9,000 a job, which is very cheap by American standards, way below recruiting businesses from elsewhere, which run somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 per job. An increase in sales outside the region. One of the goals we set for ourselves, there was almost no exporting going on in this region. All the sales were local serving. They were taking place there. We increased sales outside the region by 296%. And total sales revenue from outside the region increased by 31% during this four-year pilot program. We've since handed this off to the locals, and they've moved forward with the program. I want to look at a couple of other metrics. One of the things we're very interested in is there really a connection between skill development and economic well-being of a company? So we looked at average sales revenue and median sales revenue, and we pitted that against the levels of skill that we had in Central Louisiana, level 1, 2, and 3. And you can see that it's a substantial increase in revenue as you move up the ladder of skill development. Now, there are always other competing variables here, but the fact that we were able to pinpoint this to our program and to a 4-year period and control a lot of those variables makes us much more confident in these numbers than we would be if they were just taken out there in the general population. I'll show you something similar for the Advantage Valley. That's the one in West Virginia. And you see a similar result here as well. 73 entrepreneurs and their businesses included in this grouping. So there does seem to be a correlation between skill level and one's ability to generate revenue through one's business. Now, what I just showed you were the metrics, and of course economic developers, government officials, all of us really, business people as well, like metrics. But I would argue to you that the only reason that we got those kind of metrics is because of the work we did, as one of my colleagues like to say, down in the dirt. Actually getting out there and working with the entrepreneurs. And I want to tell some stories of the kind of coaching that was done in a couple of our areas to give you a feel for the level of effort that goes into this. And the first example I'll give you is from Central Louisiana. And I call this an example of being able to move an entrepreneur from so-called necessity entrepreneurship to opportunity entrepreneurship. And let me step back and explain what those are. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is an international study of entrepreneurship, Australia participates as well. I think there's now 60-some countries that are in that project, and it's been going on for 12 to 15 years. Baruch College is a partner of Babson College in administering this program. This program likes to bifurcate entrepreneurship into two types. On the one hand, they call it necessity entrepreneurship when the entrepreneur is an entrepreneur only because they have to be, only because they have no other options in the economy. They can't find a job. They call it opportunity entrepreneurship when the entrepreneur intentionally starts the business in order to create wealth and pursue innovation, meet the needs of a set of customers. Now, that's nice in terms of teaching us a little bit about the nature of entrepreneurship, but what that forgets, what that does, is it puts entrepreneurs into buckets. And I find that anytime you do that, people tend to stay in those buckets. And so necessity entrepreneurs become welfare cases. They're just people that we're propping up until we can find a job for them. And necessity entrepreneurs are the people who get all our attention. We're going to pump all our money into them because they're going to create our jobs and generate our wealth. What that doesn't recognize is that the reality of entrepreneurship is that it's a spectrum. And it's a spectrum along which entrepreneurs can move. It's possible to be a necessity entrepreneur today, but an opportunity entrepreneur next year. And this is what we wanted to prove in this project. And Central Louisiana was a good place because we had 25% below the poverty rate, and basically we had a good chance to work with a lot of necessity entrepreneurs and demonstrate to people that they were wrong about this idea of putting people into buckets. So the story I'm going to tell you is about a woman entrepreneur who was a restaurateur in Alexandria, Louisiana, and she ran a small storefront Mexican restaurant. It was definitely a necessity business. She made just enough profit to keep a roof over her family's head and bread on the table. But she came into the entrepreneurial development system, and she worked with her coach, she worked with her peer group, and after about a year, it was becoming very evident to all of us that she was becoming more confident. So as her skills grew, she became more confident. That was helping her to think bigger about her business. So one day she walks into her coach's office, and she's smiling, and she seems very happy, and the coach says, "So Maria, what are you so excited about today?" And she said, "You know, I've been thinking about my business, and I realized that my tamales, which are kind of corn flour wrapped meat, my tamales are popular throughout the region. And actually people will come up from New Orleans or they'll come up from Houston to have my tamales. People love them. why couldn't I manufacture my tamales and sell them all over the country? And her coach smiled at her because he realized this was a pivotal point in her development, and he said, why couldn't you? And that was the beginning of a shift for somebody from being a restaurateur to a manufacturer, and somebody who was an opportunity entrepreneur. Again, I would emphasize it was about building skills and the confidence that goes with building those skills. People can move, they can change. The second example I want to give you is also from Central Louisiana. I call this coaching by field trip. In Central Louisiana, we had an entrepreneur who was a cabinet maker. He made kitchen cabinets, kitchen cupboards. He made bathroom cabinetry, etc., for individuals. And he really was pretty loose about the way he priced. You know, he'd kind of walk in and somebody'd say, well, how much would you charge if you did this? And he'd kind of come up with a number off the top of his head. And his coach kept pushing him. He said, you know, you got to learn how to do job costing. You need to understand how much it costs you to make these cabinets so you can figure out what the value of your time is and what you ought to be charging your customers. Because this guy thought that as long as he had money in his bank account, he must be doing all right. Well, there's all kinds of wrong about that, but I won't go into the other things. But the issue here was that he really didn't want to adopt this idea, too much discipline in this idea of job costing. So the coach decided he'd take him on a little field trip, and so he took him out to Home Depot, which is like our Bunnings. And basically they went into this large hardware store, and the coach says, okay, I want you to build me a cabinet, and here's my specifications. Now, let's go around and let's find the materials and let's see what it costs. So they go and they find every item that was necessary to build this cabinet. They record it on a list. They record its cost for the amount that he would need to make the cabinet. And when they were done, the coach said to him, well, what do you have there, Gary? And Gary looked at him and he said, well, you know, I know what it's going to cost now to get the materials necessary to build this cabinet. He said, okay, good. Now, what's your time worth? Which is always a big question for especially level 1 entrepreneurs. What's your time worth? And so they had this conversation about that because that was going to determine what Gary's price should be. Well, Gary learned a lot that day, but he also got a bonus because he was out there in the field with his coach. They ran into the manager of the store who had been kind of watching them and wondering what they were doing. It wasn't all that busy in the store that day. So he came up to them and he struck up a conversation. He learned a little bit about Gary and what he could do and what he was learning from his coach and the fact that he had a coach. And he was so impressed that he said, well, you know, as luck would have it, the person who does our cabinetry work quit yesterday. Would you like a contract? So Gary walks away appreciating job costing, and he has a big contract, a regular contract with Home Depot. So coaching can be very valuable in many ways. Getting entrepreneurs out there in the field and practicing is also important as well. One more quick example. This comes from the Advantage Valley EDS, the one in West Virginia. This is the story about an entrepreneur who graded out on the rise as being a level 2 entrepreneur. And as many entrepreneurs who are starting to become more skilled often do, he was kind of cocky about that. And he figured he knew what he needed to know. And he was beginning to think he didn't really need a coach anymore, and you know, he didn't need to listen to what his peers had to say. You know, he knew it all, and he admitted that that's the way he felt. And so his coach decided, I'm going to make, before I cut him loose and turn him away from the EDS if he really thinks he's not getting anything out of this, the coach says, I'm going to give him one more chance. I'm going to set up a meeting for him with a level 4 entrepreneur so they can have a conversation. Well, he did that, and he, a level 2, sits down with a level 4 and has this 2-hour conversation, and he comes out and he says to his coach, you know, I can't believe how much more that guy knows than I do. He said, you know, I've got a lot of work to do, and I better get busy, but one thing makes me feel really good. I know what I have to do to get to his level. And I think that's one of the advantages of measuring skills, thinking about it in terms of levels. It gives people a goal. They begin to understand what it means to be a higher level entrepreneur. They can see role models, they can identify with them, and then they can work and understand the kind of work that it takes to get to the next level. So this entrepreneur was humbled by his meeting with an entrepreneur at a higher level of skill. All right, let me come to my wrap-up here. And, you know, in light of what I've learned over the last 27 years, I just make a few general recommendations to you as you think about fostering entrepreneurship. And hopefully you can avoid some of the mistakes that we made in North America and frankly continue to make. But, you know, it's one of those things where there are some things I think generally that can be done. And one of those is to really emphasize this human development approach to economic development. Don't just assume that entrepreneurs already know what they need to know. So that all you have to do is hand off a loan to them or hand off some equity capital or send them to a class on QuickBooks or whatever it may be, and they're going to turn out to be wonderful. It doesn't work like that. Entrepreneurs have to be prepared to use the resources that we provide them. And if you're providing level 3 resources to a level 1 entrepreneur, you're wasting your time. So focusing on human development and developing skills is important. I'd also urge you to fully embrace this whole entrepreneurship-based economic development because I do think it works. I think the jury's out on some of the metrics, but certainly we're finding at the local level anyway that this can be very impactful. And one thing to keep in mind is that entrepreneurship-based economic development is patient economic development. It's not the quick fix. It's hard for politicians to embrace because they live on election cycles, and those tend to be short. But the fact of the matter is we're going to have to drop that at some point because if we're going to do this the right way, we're going to build from the bottom up. We're going to do what Christian Gibbons calls economic gardening. We're going to tend our own garden. We're going to grow our own entrepreneurs. We're going to grow our own economies because that's the only way we can trust we're going to get what we need. We need to leverage our strengths. I know everybody tells you to leverage your strengths, but you have to understand what they are first, right? So going out and understanding the entrepreneurial resources that you have, the entrepreneurs and the enterprises, who's out there thinking and acting entrepreneurially now? You might be surprised how many people are doing that. Create an ecosystem of support. I think that's what we try to do in the EDS. Support for entrepreneurs by building an ecosystem that really provides them with what they need in a form in which they need it. And then finally, I'd urge you to think about the entrepreneurs and enterprises in your communities as a portfolio of business assets, because that's what they are. And then manage them as a financial portfolio manager would manage them. Look for the strengths, look for the weaknesses, look for the gaps, and work with those and be very strategic about what you do. Make sure you have a diversified portfolio. My colleague Greg Lichtenstein and I have another creation that we call the Pipeline of Entrepreneurs and Enterprises. And it's really a way of helping economic developers to think about their economies in this very way, as a portfolio of business assets, and how they can manage that as a pipeline. And of course, the two important things in a pipeline are volume and flow, right? You want enough volume going through the pipeline that you get what's desired at the end, and you want to maintain flow because if there are breaks in the pipeline or there are clogs in the pipeline, then what you're growing, what you're moving through the pipeline is not getting through. And I'll give you just a real quick diagram to give you a visual of what I'm talking about. The pipeline of entrepreneurs and enterprises involves the coming together of the skill level of the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial team and the stage in the business life cycle. So that when you look at each one of these squares here, that represents a set of coordinates for the quality of a business. So you're looking at skill, which is a measure of quality of the entrepreneur, and you're looking at stage and life cycle, which is a measure of quality of the business. When you're developing quality, that's true development. I mean, we call ourselves economic developers, but we're really economic growthers. We're always poised looking at growth. But the fact of the matter is, growth is scalar. It's just more of the same. So if it's not good what you have, why do you want more of it? You want to make it better, and then you want to grow it. And what the pipeline is saying is, yeah, volume is important, quantity is important, growth is important, but so is development, and development should come before growth. So if you think about your economy in that way, you think about your portfolio of entrepreneurs and enterprises, you have a better chance of being strategic, and you'll truly be entrepreneur focused. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I believe we can entertain some questions.
Thank you, Tom. What we're going to do now is open up the floor to questions. I'm going to walk around with this microphone, so if you've got a question, please talk into the mic, and then we'll go from there. So who wants to kick off first? Just get this switched on. Who was first? Who had the hand up? Richard. Hello.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Tom, for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Tom, my query is really just one about clarifying some numbers that you gave us. In the employment opportunities that were created in your project in Louisiana, I think there were some 300 odd jobs that were created. Are those jobs directly created, and or does that take into account the multiplier effect as well for those?
It does not take into account the multiplier effect. Those are just directly created
Because I
jobs.
was looking at those large numbers in US dollars, then I thought there had to be more there. So there's potentially 4 or 5 times that, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we've got a few around here, haven't we? We'll go in a circle.
Hi, Paul Ring. Thank you, Tom. That was fantastic. It seems to me that entrepreneurial activity is suppressed by parents, and that if people come from a non-poor family, they're likely to be suppressed by risk aversion and all sorts of things. And so some of your examples have been very much about poor people getting higher up the ladder, but I think my day-to-day stuff's involved with getting rich people to get out the door and pull their finger out, or whatever the word is, that allows them to do entrepreneurial stuff without taking away all mummy and daddy's money. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you really want entrepreneurship at all places and in the along the socioeconomic spectrum. Risk aversion is a big problem, and a lot of that comes from fear of failure. And one of the things that we try to do is help our entrepreneurs to understand, no matter who they are, to understand that failure is it's not the end of the world. It's not something for which you should be ashamed. That it's actually a step along the learning curve. And we try to demonstrate that for people, and we try to help them to reflect on what they learn from their failures. In our entrepreneurial development system, you may fail and you may fall out, but you can come back and you can try again. And so being receptive to failure as a learning device as opposed to a stigma, I think is really important. And as I said before about risk, so much of the issue, let me step back for a moment. There's a study out there of 40,000 entrepreneurs as compared to a control group of average citizens. What that study found is that entrepreneurs, on average, are more risk averse than the general population. Now, you say, how could that be? Well, the fact of the matter is, as I said before, they know how to manage risk. They understand the risk-reward balance, and they know how to think about getting the maximum reward for the minimum risk. And so finding ways to minimize that risk is how they function. If you can minimize risk, you're willing to take on more of it because its impacts are less for you. And so I think that's another way around. So one of the things that we do a lot of talking about with our entrepreneurs and a lot of experiential exercises are with, okay, you have a risky situation, how much you manage this risk? What kind of things can you do to make it less risky for you and still reap that reward that you want?
Thank you, Tom. Some very interesting ideas for management. Have you given any, there's plenty of farmers or people connected with farmers here. Have you given any thought or had experience with your ideas in farm management?
Yes, we have thought about that, and some of the entrepreneurs in some of our rural EDS projects were farmers, and so we did work with them. It's also been interesting for me to see what some of the farmers here in Australia are doing. I was fascinated by the bus tour, the Geelong area bus tour that we went on, at some of the innovation that was taking place out there. It's very interesting because these folks were small farmers. They're up against corporate farms. It's hard to compete if you're competing just on the commoditization of your agricultural products. So they're figuring out ways to add value on their farms, and they're taking advantage of some of the key movements that are going on out there, like sustainable agriculture, like value-added agriculture, like farm to table, as we call it in the U.S. There's a host of food security. There's a host of things that are going on out there in the food world that translate into niche market opportunities for entrepreneurs. And certainly we saw some of that with the case of Ravens Creek Farm, where the entrepreneurial farmers who run that particular farm have added a cafe at which they use some of their food in kind of farm-to-table fashion. They're going into agritourism, inviting families to come on the site and learn more about farming. They have niche markets for their beef and their pork. And so there are entrepreneurial and innovative things that can be done out there that I'm seeing more and more of all the time relative to farmers who work on small farms or family farms.
Tom, do you lecture bankers and other finance providers as well?
I try, but they don't listen to me.
And question, is finance, is it an inhibiting factor? I mean, that lady who had the restaurant and then set up a production facility, I mean, that's a quantum leap in,
yes, it is.
in equity, loan, finance, or whatever.
But
do they understand? Because here you often get the feeling that bankers don't understand,
right,
and will not take that risk.
Right, and one of the things that we've experienced just by virtue of having that ecosystem that the EDS creates, and bankers knowing that these entrepreneurs that we're working with have a coach that they're with and that they're developing their skills, we can sell that to bankers as a hedge against risk. And that becomes attractive. So for the woman you were mentioning, it wasn't too hard to get her the capital that she needed actually to grow. Even in this very rural, sparsely populated area, we were able to get her that kind of help. Now that's not always true everywhere, and sometimes finance is an encumbrance. And you know, we've tried to tell venture capitalists that they ought to use this in their processes, and we've been shown the door. So you know, but we all know what their batting average is, right? So. They'd be sitting on my bench if they played for me. But anyway, it's very interesting. It's a hard sell sometimes to financial folks that this is something that ought to be done. And many of them believe that they already do this and they know how to do it. And so it's genuinely difficult to change minds.
Tom, thank you for that. Michelle Levine, Roy Morgan Research. Look, I found that incredibly challenging. I think everyone probably didn't, but I did. To me, it challenged a whole bunch of things around nature versus nurture. And I still find it difficult to believe that Steve Jobs was not just like the rest of us when he was a little boy. And I think we've all seen, you know, little kids that were baby entrepreneurs and seen them grow into big entrepreneurs. So I guess I'm wondering, is this just a change in definition? Everything you've said is absolutely sensible, a really good thing to be doing, but I wonder, are we actually just talking about being better and better operators as opposed to entrepreneurs? And you might answer the question easily for me if you could tell me how you pick them. Because one of the things you said was identifying entrepreneurs.
Yes.
So that might help me cross into the new paradigm.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of disagreement about who entrepreneurs are. If you talk to people at Harvard or Stanford in their entrepreneurship program, they would tell you that the only real entrepreneurs are the people who create gazelles, the Steve Jobs of the world, the rock star entrepreneurs, the Richard Bransons. We could talk about quirks in personality maybe as being a factor, but at the end of the day, all those people started out on rung one. And they had to work their way forward. Some of them move at a faster pace than others, granted. But for the most part, they all had to work their way up. And the danger I find in thinking about entrepreneurship as being a product of nature is, and this gets to your question about how do you pick them, is that it becomes a gambling game to try to identify entrepreneurs. So who has the right stuff to be an entrepreneur? Can I see the person who has the right genetics to be an entrepreneur? You know, what can you really do about somebody's genetics? I guess pretty soon we'll be able to do genetic engineering, so maybe we can just make entrepreneurs. I don't know, talk about being the maximum operators. But the fact of the matter is, I think if we want to maximize the number of people who have the capability of being an entrepreneur, and for me that means they have two things: motivation and innovation. So if you're motivated, if you have a passion about what you're doing, and you're innovative, you're bringing a new product or service to market, or finding a new market for it, or creating a new process by which it's developed, then you're an entrepreneur. And if that's the case, then we don't need to pick them. We say, we're here to support you, and if you can convince us that you have the proper motivation and that you have an innovation, we'll work with you. And that means then that we're not, as gamblers say, we're not leaving a lot on the table, and that we're not having to gamble. We're reaching more people. Clearly not everybody can be an entrepreneur, and I'd be the first to admit that. But I would say that there are far more people out there that have the capability of being an entrepreneur than we give credit to. And as long as we keep them down and treat it like it was an elitist thing where you had to be a weird kid, or you have to have some personality quirk, or you have to be a neurotic, or whatever you want to make up about it, we're going to leave a lot of people behind who could do us a lot of good in our economy. So that's the way I look at it. You can't do a thing about talent, but you can develop skill. And, even talented athletes have to develop their skills. They have to spend a lot of time on their craft. But we have this fixation with people where we kind of see them, if they're successful today, then they must have sprung forth from the earth fully formed. But the fact of the matter is they all came from the bottom. I don't care who they are. They all came from down on the lower rung of that ladder, or off the ladder altogether, and somebody along the way helped them. None of them did it all by themselves. Steve Jobs had a whole group of people who he hung out with in New Mexico for a while, who learned from one another. And it's those kinds of networks and that kind of social capital building that also help people to become successful entrepreneurs. So, I'm being a bit flippant, and I apologize, but the fact of the matter is that I'm a really strong believer in working on what you can work on, and what you can work on is skill. That's what you can change.
Okay.
Hang on a moment.
How you get that young person who doesn't, who isn't connected, who didn't go to the right schools, who isn't in the right employment, who doesn't know the right people, who's got a bloody great idea. How do those of us who come across those people link them to the right people? What's your view in how we build those linkages? I'm thinking of a particular guy, and he grows a particular product, and he comes to me and says, how the hell do I get, how the hell do I market? Where do I go to expand? I'm glad if I know.
Well, It's a great question, and it's important for those of us in rural areas to think about, especially, although I see it in urban neighborhoods as well, the same problem. I sit on the board of an organization in the United States called the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship. And one of the major divisions of that organization focuses on what they call youth entrepreneurship. And they go into rural communities and they help people build programs that do just the kind of thing that you're talking about. So it's not just teaching kids how to run a lemonade stand, but it's how do you meet the right people? How do you get out into the community? How can you contribute to your community? It's a multifaceted approach that they do, and it's really, truly effective. Craig Schroeder, who runs that program, just does fabulous work. And the communities that they work with have become very successful, not only in helping those kids who are disaffected or disconnected to be effective, but also in keeping them in their communities because they're starting to find their own opportunities there. They're not waiting for someone else to create an opportunity for them, which is the entrepreneurial mentality. So I would urge you to take a look at the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship's website and their youth entrepreneurship program. There's some great reports, technical reports on there from their work, and some stories from the field, which I think really answer your question on the ground.
Okay, so I'm going to take 2 more questions before we close the lunch, and then there'll be an opportunity to talk to Tom afterwards. So, Malcolm?
Tom, I'm ex-Tasmanian. Can I suggest when the new governor's position comes available, you apply for the governor of Tasmania? Judging by your figures for Louisiana, you've only got 100,000 more people, great deal more land to do, and you could coach them and be paid for it and live in a very fine house. I'm just a bit muddled in my own mind for an institution like Marcus Oldham or those interested in agriculture, whether they may be better off aiming at the top 10, 20 or 25% quartile of practitioners, whether they're young or old, and if they were, because it would occur to me that many of the skills are already learnt and efficient, would that be a negative in your opinion, or do you need a balance between a broader percentage of the active population?
Yeah, I think you want a balance, and you know, I'd be the last person to tell anybody that I see entrepreneurship as the magic bullet that's going to kill all our economic werewolves. I think you do want to work with what you have. I also think that those folks are great potential mentors and role models to the new people coming along. What I'd like to see is more connection among those activities so that you're not just doing that and doing this, but you're finding ways to link those things so that everybody's benefiting from them.
Professor Lyons, now some people might think banks might be an obstacle to entrepreneurship, but I'm wondering whether government might be an even greater obstacle to entrepreneurship. So I'm wondering 2 things. One, have you considered expanding your entrepreneurship industry into the business of government so we develop some entrepreneurs in government that enhances their skill set to understand potential entrepreneurs?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, you know, the old adage, if I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. I've just scrolled through the sort of Business Grants Australia website, and there's so many opportunities for you to go and access the DRIP that it's too numerous to mention. But I think we've now created a commissioner to help you weave your way through the access to assistance, let alone the access to regulation that impacts on your business. So 2 questions. How have you moved into the area of government to retrain and upskill government? And secondly, how do you get entrepreneurs to weave their way through the myriad of all the levels of government, especially here in Australia where we're very overgoverned?
Right. Well, in answer to your first question, I guess my answer is I'm moving in that direction. I actually have a background. My training is in urban and regional planning. And the very first place I worked was in government, in economic development planning, which is one of the reasons why I don't do it anymore. Because it wasn't very effective. And what I've learned as I've learned more about entrepreneurship and how to foster it is that it's very important it's just as important, I would say, for government officials to be entrepreneurial as it is for the entrepreneurs that they're working with. When I work with government organizations, I'll encourage them to be just as entrepreneurial as the people they're trying to help. They need to be role models to them also. And so, yes, I'm moving in that direction. I also teach social entrepreneurship, which kind of addresses the cracks between what government can do and what the private sector or can't do and what the private sector won't do. So it's encouraging people to use entrepreneurship as a way to pursue social mission and environmental mission. And I'm finding that that also is a pretty effective way to get some of the things done that we would hope government would do for us, and it just can't seem to do it. And that we would hope the private sector would help with, and they just don't seem to want to do it. And you can solve some of these pressing problems by using entrepreneurship. So those are my thoughts on that. With regard to the other question, part of the reason that we created the entrepreneurial development system was to address that very issue, that there are these myriad resources out there that don't come with an owner's manual, so you have no idea where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there. Part of the problem is, again, what I mentioned at the top of the presentation, that we've been too resources-based oriented. So the focus has been, well, if we provide resources, then people will use those resources and they'll be successful. And if that doesn't work, we'll just provide more resources. Well, clearly that's neither efficient nor effective. Which is one of the reasons I also like thinking about this from the perspective of skills and from levels of entrepreneurship, because that gives us a way to sort the resources. So certain resources are appropriate at certain levels of skill to the entrepreneur, others are not. So if we can start segmenting the resources in such a way that it fits the segmentation of entrepreneurs, then we can start getting some matches. I think that's one way to do it, but you're absolutely right. Right now, it's a maze. And really, entrepreneurs are being asked to run the maze, and if they come out the other end, they must have been born to be an entrepreneur.
Bureaucrat.
Or a bureaucrat, right. So, it's just something that really needs to be addressed. I think it's a problem.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Well, look, clearly your presentation has sparked a number of questions, quite a lot of good comments, and look, let's put our hands together for Tom.
Thank you.
To close the meeting, we've got Richard to come up, Richard Anderson, who's Director and Chairman of Harwood Andrews Lawyers, who are also a sponsor of our Centre for the Study of Rural Australia. Richard has a number of roles at Marcus. He's also involved with the Marcus Oldham College Council, and he's also Chairman of the CSRA, which is a committee that oversees all the research and development work at Marcus, including the likes of the Entrepreneurs program. So Richard, please come up to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along today. Those of you who have been fortunate enough to come to these gatherings before will know what a fabulous location this is. In the centre of Melbourne. We're very grateful to the Morgan organisation for allowing us to use this this spot. In fact, I think it'd be very hard pressed to find somewhere better, so thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the William Buckland Foundation for having the confidence in Marcus Oldham to actually undertake the EntreBiz program, which is what brings Tom to us. It was a very generous arrangement that we've got with the William Buckland Foundation, for which we're grateful, but it comes out of a shared passion for the belief in the importance of vibrant, economically successful rural communities in Australia and in Victoria, of course, particularly, And out of that shared vision, we've been able to start the EntreBiz program. And we're only part-way through at the moment, and I'm hoping to be standing here in not too distant future talking about the outcome of it, and hopefully we'll have some figures to compare with Tom's. I'm not quite sure they'll compare to Louisiana figures, but we'll be trying. It might be scalable, Tom, to be sure. But I'm confident that with the assistance of Tom and Yasmin and her team that we're going to be able to make an impact, and it'll be very interesting to see. And Tom, I think, with his systematic approach to the development of entrepreneurship, is sort of showing us a way that this can be done, which isn't just random, it's actually a structured and sensible way, and it will put real economic development into regions. So thank you very much, Tom. You've generated a number of questions which all come, of course, from the passion people have about this particular issue, which obviously you share in spades, and we're delighted to have you in Australia. And I know that there's one or two people who'd like to talk to you after lunch today too, to see how what you know could be used in their particular causes. So if you join me once again thanking Tom.